This is politicization. It is a stereotype in our day to say that everything is political. We were reminded only recently that politicization is denounced by both official moralists and the good people. But what is politicization? We have been given two of its dimensions. Politicization is represented by the importance and growing frequency of ideological debates, and it is manifested by the tendency to treat all social problems in the world according to patterns and procedures found in the political world. Though these two characteristics are indeed part of the phenomenon of politicization, they are much too limited and specific to provide a full description. It is quite true that one of the aspects of politicization in our society is the volume of ideological debate, doctrinal conflict, systemic argumentation along certain lines. But politicization also exists in countries where ideological debates do not occupy an important place. What is more, we must ask why these ideological debates have increased and what attitude people assume with regard to political matters, and not just to one or another doctrine. On the other hand, it is also true that there is a tendency to treat all social problems within the procedural framework of politics, that is, with debates, conferences, and so on. But this is an extremely narrow and limited view of politicization, for it must be stated first that all problems have, in our time, become political. It is not just a question of accepted political procedures being applied to questions that at first glance do not seem political. The point is that these questions are, by now, in the political realm, and political procedures are applied to them because they have become part and parcel of political affairs. The essential element that must be taken into consideration if we want to understand a total phenomenon of politicization is a fact that is, if not the cause, at least the moving force of this phenomenon. The fact is the growth of the state itself. Governmental action is applied to a constantly growing number of realms. This means through which the state can act are constantly growing. Its personnel and its functions are constantly growing. Its responsibilities are growing. All this goes hand in hand with inevitable centralization and with the total organization of society in the hands of the state. The nation-state is the most important reality of our day. It is much more fundamental in our world than economic reality. Nowadays, the state directs the economy. To be sure, the state must take economic factors into account. The economy is not an inert object in the hands of an arbitrary and capricious ruler, but the ruler versed in economic techniques determines the economy much more than the economy determines the state. The state is not just a superstructure. Marxist analysis was valid only in the 19th century, when the emergence of uncontrolled, explosive economic power relegated a weak, liberal, and clearly delineated state to the shadows and subjugated it. But today, the major social phenomenon is the state, becoming ever more extended, ever more assured, and everywhere standing in the limelight. Of course, Lenin knew well that every revolution must be political, but in his last letter, his testament, he admitted that the emergence, evolution, and persistence of the Soviet state was for him a surprising and disturbing phenomenon. It was not as a result of a crisis, accident, or a disagreeable necessity in the pursuit of the highest objectives that the Soviet state has never ceased becoming stronger, despite its illusory reduction in power since the days of Khrushchev. Only the believers can still accept the dogma of the state's withering away. It seems clear today that the Soviet states concerned with the administration of all things by no means signifies its decline, but rather its having become absolute. This development could take place only as a result of man's need to conform, which is the aim of all propaganda. In this confirmation of its power, the Soviet state is not fulfilling a special destiny. Soviet society is not evolving according to special laws, and the transition to socialism has not modified general socio-political trends. What we see in Soviet society is the general development of the state in our world, its growth and structure. To be sure, we are aware of all the differences that may exist between the Soviet state and the American state, the British state, or the French state. There are juridical and constitutional differences of practice and intention. They exist, but are of little consequence compared with the similarities, and particularly with the general trend. There are more differences between the American state of 1910 and that of 1960, despite the constitutional sameness, than between the latter and the Soviet state, despite the constitutional differences. The idea that the state has become a phenomenon in itself, the most important in our society, is still expressed by certain Marxists in the well-known analysis of the emergence of a third class, the bureaucracy, the great cadres, the major technicians, the class of those constituting the real political power. The fact that the political power eventually produced in its own class is probably the most telling sign of society's takeover by the state. And in our days, the individual's seizure by the political powers is much graver and more decisive than economic alienation. The substitution of political slavery for economic slavery is the current fraudulent exchange. At present, the greatest problem is the citizen in the clutches of political power. In one sense, we can feel reassured, for here we return to well-known problems always debated by political men and philosophers, the relation of man to state power. Let us call upon Plato and Montesquieu for assistance. The danger of the individual being absorbed by the state? Let us appeal to Hobbes and Rousseau. But I want to stress that aside from the customary reflections on the nature of power, to which insufficient attention is being paid in our day, the uniqueness of our situation must be taken into account. The given facts of the problem have changed, and past political philosophy can be of little help. It seems to me that there is an entire, so far little explored, intermediary zone between the zone studied by political scientists, who often remained at the surface of events, and the zone of pure political thought. I could almost say political metaphysics, that has a certain permanence. I shall try to keep myself in the zone between the two. The other element, the growth of the state, is the first, that conditions and determines the politicization of society is the growth of the individual's participation in political life. It is a doctrinal offshoot of democracy, of various arrangements in different republican states, of demographic growth that brings the masses closer to the seat of power, of speedier communications, development in education, and finally, of the fact that the state's decisions increasingly concern everybody, and that the state does not feel assured of its legitimacy except by the express support of the people. These are the reasons for and symptoms of this growing participation. All this forms a solid body of evidence, but one neglected fact must be stressed. It is accepted that since the 18th century, the individual's participation in political affairs has increased. But while this is generally admitted, before the 18th century there was little such participation in the West, the corollary is generally admitted, except on rare occasions. Political affairs, in and by themselves, and in the eyes of man, formerly had little importance, in the view of the fact that we judge everything in relation to political affairs. This seems unbelievable. How can we admit that in those past centuries, political affairs were not a subject of interest, of passion? The lack of public participation was much less the result of an autocratic character of the prevailing regimes than of great indifference on the part of the public itself. Nevertheless, It seems that for centuries, political affairs, except for rare moments, produced little activity, were the care of specialists in a specialized domain, or a prince's game that affected a very limited number of individuals. True political revolutions were palace revolutions, and when they took place, the masses were rarely more than extras or stage decorations. However that may be, even if this claim does not ring quite true, active participation in political affairs by the masses is a new phenomenon. To think of everything as political, to conceal everything by using this word, with intellectuals taking the cue from Plato and several others, to place everything in the hands of the state, to appeal to the state in all circumstances, to subordinate the problems of the individual to those of the group, to believe that political affairs are on everybody's level and that everybody is qualified to deal with them. These factors characterize the politicization of modern man, and as such comprise a myth. The myth then reveals itself in beliefs and, as a result, easily elicits almost religious fervor. We cannot conceive of society except as directed by a central, omnipresent, and omnipotent state. What used to be the utopian view of society, with the state playing the role of the brain, not only has been ideologically accepted in the present time, but also has been profoundly integrated into the depths of our consciousness. To act in a contrary fashion would place us in radical disagreement with the entire trend of our society, a punishment we cannot possibly accept. We can no longer even conceive of a society in which the political function on the part of the governmental authority would be limited by external means. We have arrived at the monistic idea of power that stops power. We can no longer conceive of a society with autonomous in-between groups or diverging activities. The primary role of political affairs is one of the common sociological presuppositions shared by all and growing in all countries. We consider it obvious that everything must be unreservedly subjected to the power of the state. It would seem extraordinary to us if any activity should escape it. The expansion of the state's encroachment upon all affairs is exactly paralleled by our conviction that things must be that way. Any attempt on the part of any enterprise, university, or charitable enterprise to remain independent of the state seems anachronistic to us. The state directly incarnates the commonweal. The state is the great ordainer, the great organizer, the center upon which all voices of all people converge, and from which all reasonable, balanced, impartial, i.e., just solutions emerge. If by chance we find this not so, we are profoundly scandalized. So filled are we with this image of the state's perfection. In our current consciousness, no other center of decision in our social body can exist. To repeat, it is not just the fact of the state being at the center of our lives that is crucial, but our spontaneous and personal acceptance of it as such. We believe that for the world to be in good order, the state must have all the powers. Conversely, we find a rather curious attitude among certain social psychologists who regard every phenomenon of authority at whatever level, in whatever groups, or in whatever way it manifests itself, as never anything but an accident, whose paradigm is the state. If a leader emerges in a group, or if a father exercises his authority in the family, or if a technician imposes himself upon a corporation, the phenomenon of authority is taken out of its proper context and traced back conceptually to approximate that of the state, so that all instances of authority are microcosms of central authority. The place we accord in our hearts to the state and political activity leads us to an interpretation of history which we regard primarily as political history. For a long time, only events concerning empires and nations, only wars and conquests, only political revolutions were taken into account. Undoubtedly, that conception of history is obsolete. It has been replaced by the importance attributed to political and administrative structures. A society has no reality for us except in its political institutions, and those institutions take precedence over all others, despite the importance assumed by economic and social history. Above all, we cannot escape the strange view that history is ultimately a function of the state. Only where the state is history worth the name. The Merovingian times are so dark only because the state was inconsequential. The Middle Ages are merely an intermediary age, a period without name, only because they unfolded between two periods when the state was glorious, the Roman and the monarchistic. Between the two, there was this regrettable interlude in which the historian must look at society as unformed because it was not directed from a summit, animated by a single will, or centrally organized. Fortunately, the kings restored the state with iron hand. France again became a property of value, and the superiority of that restoration was contrasted to the disorderly dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. To be sure, because we are Democrats, we are against Louis XIV's monarchic authoritarianism, but he retains over our secret affection because he was the state. And we are profoundly irritated with de Gaulle because he promised but failed to produce the centralized, impartial, all-powerful state, so powerful that it would have only to show its power without exercising it, the unchallengeable and sure state that would have given us pride and peace of mind. How many times have we read and heard of efforts that would finally give the state all the needed authority? We are poor lost children who seem no longer to remember what the means and the price of that would be. This aspiration, this unconscious assigning of the supreme rule to the state leads us immediately to the consideration that everything is now its business. The question returns again and again, like some evidence that it would be absurd to protest. But after all, what is there that is not political? To be sure, if we begin by conceiving society as a whole, made up of dead pieces without autonomy, receiving an active place only in a coherent system, and obtaining life only from the supreme impetus of political power, then we must accept the suggested answer as evident. And it is evident for us contemporaries, but one should be aware of the fact that it is based on a prejudice and on adherence to a preconception. What we see here is the result of the process of politicization in ourselves, the penetration into our unconscious of the truth that an ultimately political process rules our lives. As a result, we are led to render all questions political. Those which are not must be politicized because our frame of mind dictates that ultimately everything is political. This is not only fixed in the minds of the masses, but is stated to be so and justified by the intellectuals. Take Talcott Parsons. Political affairs are the center of integration of all analytical elements of the social system and not one of these particular elements. If art is not a part of this is only because we do not notice it. To notice it more clearly, one need only encourage attributing political sense or value to art. Make the artist feel that his efforts are in vain if he is not engaged or does not manufacture doves that can be plastered on all the walls. The constant confusion between political affairs and society is a new phenomenon in history. Undoubtedly, there were some earlier models, the Aztec Empire, Egypt, perhaps China, and to some extent Rome. But there we must make two major reservations. In those days, the state did not have the means to execute its intentions. The mass of the people did not spontaneously, or one might say ontologically, offer its faith and ideology to the state. If there was a religion sanctioned by the state, there was not ordinarily a religion of the state, worship of the state. In other eras, a man could be regarded as being committed by being involved in the structure and the collective life of his society, in the arts, science, religion, etc. He is no longer considered committed, however, unless the implications of his activity are directly political. To participate in non-political activities that are nevertheless definitely related to our society is regarded as without value. A poet restricting himself to being a poet without signing petitions or manifestos would immediately be accused of retiring to his ivory tower. Nowadays, we prefer Aristophanes' political pieces to Aeschylus. As the renowned and very politicized French actress Simone Signoret said, "We want to bring a message to the world." In this general trend, values are also being politicized. As Jean Barret has said, all values have political connotation, in fact, a political content in our eyes. Liberty, we jump with both feet from the haziest metaphysical discussion to the concept of political regimes, and from this to a political definition of freedom, which in our eyes is negligible unless it is officially incorporated in a regime, or the fruit of a constitution, or represented by the participation of a citizen in state power. To say that freedom simply means that the individual can escape the power of the state and decide for himself on the sense of his life and his work seems in our day a simplistic, ridiculous, and adolescent reaction. Similarly, justice no longer exists as a personal virtue or as the more or less attained result of the law. When we take it seriously, justice unfortunately must be endowed with some adjective, particularly the adjective social, i.e., it is ultimately regarded as political. It is up to the state to make justice prevail. There is only collective justice, and the difficult questions by legal philosophers of past centuries make no more sense to us now than does the Christian affirmation that justice is the individual's miraculous transformation by the grace of God. In our days, values that cannot be given political content or serve some political activity are not longer taken seriously. In fact, values no longer serve us as criteria of judgment to determine good or evil. Political considerations are now the preeminent value, and all others must adjust to them. Politics and its offspring, nationalism, for example, have become the cornerstone of what is good or represents progress. Political concerns are thought to be inherently excellent. Man's progress in today's society consists in his participation in political affairs. How many articles and declarations have we not read on that subject? For example, women finally become human beings because they receive political rights. To say that women, mother of the family, exerting a profound effect on the development of her children, was the true creatress in the long run, the true force from which all politics originated, is now just reactionary talk. A person without the right, in reality magical, to place a paper ballot in a box is nothing, not even a person. To progress is to receive this power, this mythical share in a theoretical sovereignty that consists in surrendering one's decisions for the benefit of someone else who will make them in one's place. Progress is to read newspapers. The political scientist Rivet meant it seriously when he said, "A man who cannot read a newspaper," Rivet was talking about Africa, "to be informed is not a man." What a strange conception of manhood. This is the political trinity: information, participation, action. That is now the order of the day and the nature of progress. People fight for economic democracy, which is expected to give them an opportunity to express their desires and affairs that touch them most closely. This economic democracy, concerned with working conditions, distribution channels, plan requirements, prices and tariffs, all things that are infinitely concrete, is now contrasted with the political democracy of a formal time, which is today regarded as merely abstract and theoretical. But let us turn the clock back 200 years. What did those who clamored for this political democracy have in mind? To attain direct and effective control over the police, not to pay taxes except those one had agreed upon, which then seemed like a voluntary contribution, not to go to war except when the people themselves wanted it, to be able to express one's ideas freely and publicly, for each and every person to be able to affect and form public opinion. Were these abstract matters? By no means. They were terribly precise and concrete. We know how important such things are, but except for ideologists who only see things in their dreams and imagination, we also know that economic democracy is the process of failing now at the very moment when it is being built. And that power attributed to the toilers in Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, or France is only theoretical and apparent. The process by which, in the 19th century, political decisions became a mere abstraction is being repeated in identical form before our eyes in connection with economic decisions now allegedly entrusted to the individual. The same farce takes place in the economic realm, always under the pretense of giving man powers in relation to the state. But it should be understood first that in this case of the modern state, powers granted to the individual are never anything but innocuous concessions, mere powers to endorse what is good for the state, the latter being the sum of all the social good. However, the masses, who do not actually participate in political affairs, firmly believe that they do, and in addition, make their illusory participation their principal criterion of dignity, personality, liberty. Colonial people finally become civilized people because they join the United Nations. Africans finally attain dignity because they share political power. And solemnly, the thinkers tell us they are entering into history. For those thinkers, no history exists where there is no politics. Who can fail to be struck by such profound politicization? To claim that the complex social organization of the Bantus or the transformation of a continent by the Manchus are not part of our history would be ridiculous. Yet it is the most profound conviction of our time that such people enter into history only when they begin to adapt their state structures and political life to the Western model. The reference to political affairs is what really counts. Now, finally, these people will make their voices heard. This judgment, only mildly exaggerated, has its corollary, the severe condemnation of apolitical people. In our society, anyone who keeps himself in reserve, fails to participate in elections, regards political debates and constitutional changes as superficial and without real impact on the true problems of man, who feels that the war in Algeria deeply affects him and his children, but fails to believe that declarations, motions, and votes change anything, will be judged very severely by everybody. He is the true heretic of our day, and society excommunicates him as the medieval church excommunicated the sorcerer. He is regarded as a pessimist, a stupid fellow, for he fails to see the very deep and secret mores in the political game. A defeatist who bows his head to fate, a bad citizen. Surely, if things go badly, it is his fault, for if he were more civic-minded, the vote would turn out differently. It is not enough to have 80% of the voters cast their vote. No, we need 100%, and democracy would be more effective. Negative judgments rain down on him. His effectiveness and his morality are judged. Even his psychic health is questioned. The unpolitical man is obviously a little paranoid or schizophrenic. Finally, the ultimate condemnation of our age is hurled at him. He must be a reactionary. This shows us that man in his entirety is being judged today in relation to political affairs, which are invested with ultimate value. In our judgment, everything has become political, and political affairs are the ultimate guidepost. Beyond them, there's nothing, and political affairs can be judged only by political considerations. One may say, of course, that politics should be in the service of man or the economy, but that does not detract from the fact that the greatness of the state, its power to organize, and man's participation in the collective via personal channels are the ultimate value symbols and criteria of our time, substituted for the religious symbols and criteria of the past. One must reach the same conclusions if one considers not just the presuppositions, prejudices, and unconscious motivations of modern man, but his conscious emotional attitude. As soon as this man involves himself in politics, he's animated by a passion without measure. In our day, political conflict has definitely become the decisive and ultimate form of conflict. It is enough to have been in contact with the fascists in 1934, the communists, or the Gaullists to understand to what extent disagreements nowadays over forms of government, or the European defense community, or other limited concerns are more fundamental than disagreements over the ultimate ends of man. It is celebrated as a victory of the spirit when anti-Christian materialists and fervent Christians collaborate, when bourgeoisie intellectuals and factory workers sit on the same committees, when fascists and Mohammedans or Christians and Mohammedans work in fraternal harmony. But it should first be asked, what is this powerful cement that permits man to overcome race and class differences and eliminates the most violent metaphysical and religious differences? There's only one: politics. Compared to a similarity of views for or against a decision regarding some war, how significant can differences be on the meaning of life? It should be asked whether this beautiful accord, celebrated with such enthusiasm, is not dearly paid for by concomitant divisions. In fact, such accords can be established only at the price of designating a common enemy, a political enemy, and the accord will be all the closer as the hatred against the other becomes more violent. As a result, Christians will drive Christians from the church, and Mohammedans will kill Mohammedans. Political disputes today are what disputes between Christians were in the 16th century. But perhaps to know whether it is Christ who saves us is ultimately much less important than the conclusion of a treaty or the choice between permanent revolution and other ways of doing things. But do not the lives of millions depend on such political decisions? They do, because our political passion creates such dependence. But the dependence need not exist, for political conflicts, political solutions, political problems, political forms are ultimate, not in themselves or by the nature of things, but by the glory we attribute to them, by the importance assigned to them by every one of us, by the frantic trembling exhibited each time the political sacrament, the flag, the chief, the slogan comes near us. We may say that the basis for this is the factual situation of the expanding state. That is true, but this state has no powers except those recognized by its subjects. I do not say it exists by virtue of what we yield, much rather it exists by virtue of our loyalties and our passions. But the remedy Marx considered a cure for political alienation no longer applies. It is no longer sufficient that man deny the state his confidence or reject its authority, as observed already by Father Suarez, for the state to appear clearly as an empty phantom. Nowadays, the crystallization of political structures, the growth of means of actions on the part of the state, and the creation of a new political class are irreversible phenomenon to the extent that they exist. In any case, one's feelings cannot change them. Thus, our passions can only reinforce political affairs and never weaken them. Traveling along this road, we are, in order to survive without an internal split, forced to attribute great good sense to political conflicts, and, proceeding in the reverse direction from what was always man's course in such matters, to jump from the expanded political sphere into metaphysics, from politized history into metahistory that knows no miracle, no ends. Moreover, instead of the consoling presence, the experience so much desired by religious people, man now experiences faith and religious conversion thanks to his participation in politics. What was lost by the church has been found by the parties, at least those worthy of the name. Faith in attainable ends, in the improvement of the social order, in the establishment of a just and peaceful system by political means, is a most profound and undoubtedly new characteristic in our society. Among the many basic definitions of man, two are joined together at this point. Homo politicus is by his very nature homo religiosus. Homo religiosus. And this faith takes shape in active virtues that can only arouse the jealousy of Christians. Look how full of devotion they are, how full of the spirit of sacrifice, these passionate men who are obsessed with politics. But people never ask whether all this is worthwhile, because these witnesses are so devoted, they invest the object of their service with their passion. In this fashion, a nation becomes a cult by virtue of the millions of dead who were sacrificed for it. It must all be true, as so many agreed, did they, to die for it. The same goes for the state, or national independence, or the victory of a political ideology. Those who are thus devoted do not remain without compensation or profit. Here they find the communion that escaped them everywhere else, on the level of political action, or in the resistance, or in the well-known solidarity of parliamentarians among themselves, or in communist cells, or in OAS groups, or in great, solemn, vibrant meetings in defense of the Republic. Man can experience the communion that he absolutely needs, but no longer finds in his family, his neighborhood, or his work. A common objective, some great popular drive in which he can participate, a camaraderie, a special vocabulary, an explanation of the world. Politics offers him these joys and symbols, these indispensable expressions of communion. These are, it seems to me, the various aspects of politicization, constituting a whole. But we still must find out whether man, once politicized, is not victim of a hoax or trapped in a cul-de-sac. Contrary to what we have just said, some speak nowadays of modern man's depoliticization. By merely looking at the distress displayed by the political scientists and essayists who analyze these depolitizations, we can measure to what extent politics have become value. If man were depolitized, what a disaster. It is as though he should cease being an artist, intelligent, or sensitive. Depolitized, an entire dimension of man would disappear. Surely political affairs are neither a game nor a useful, only moderately important pragmatic activity. They represent a genuine value and appear to give man control over his destiny. But it seems to me, if it is true that depolitization is only a temporary and local phenomenon, it must be understood in any case that it can be discerned only in relation to politicization, because modern man is politicized as he presumably never was before. Any retreat from political affairs becomes very noticeable and visible, and we experience it as retrogression. But it is not only with regard to the general movement of politicization that we can discern depoliticization. It is also within the compass of the former that the latter takes place. Depoliticization is not a phenomenon of similar magnitude. It is more limited than politicization, affects only certain areas, certain forms of behavior, and certain attitudes. Politicization, on the other hand, affects the whole conception of actual life, and even gives depoliticization a significance different than it seems to have at first glance. In order to judge the nature of depoliticization more specifically, some observations must be made. On the one hand, there really is a certain depoliticization in the form of departicipation, de-ideologization, and departisanization, and a certain reluctance to vote. On the other hand, there is an apoliticization of new groups that take take the place of weakening older political groups and a growing interest in political problems. S.M. Calvez has said it very well. A politicized mind is not the opposite of a depoliticized mind. A politicized mind is an invaded, crushed, passively submissive mind, whereas this submission provokes agitation and violence. On the other hand, we cannot assume the presence of just any depolitization. Most authors wrestling with the problems, many of whom are convinced a priori that there is depolitization, admit that the term covers variable realities, with the left complaining of the growing apathy of its militant members, parties of the loss of adherents, and so on. But ultimately, depolitization is seen as a decline of political participation in its older and more traditional forms, not as the refusal of all participation. This is true even when there is some skepticism or indifference with regard to political activity, a relativization of political affairs, or an empirical political existence that is ambiguous, prudent, and a little facetious. All this does not imply a genuine depolitization, and above all, does not signify a breach in the phenomenon of politicization, as we have described it earlier. Depolitization, as discussed by most political scientists, is really concerned only with actual participation of a democratic nature. Yet, for example, to put oneself in the hands of the state, not by default, but because of loyalty, is the height of politicization. Similarly, in a democracy, politicization is the general concept of social life. The general concept of social life is more important than participation in election meetings. There can be simultaneously a disinterest in politics and an overvaluation of political affairs. There can be a de-ideologization of controversies by the surrender of old doctrines, at the same time a mythicization of the state and the emotionalization of its problems. In such instances, depolitization is superficial, and as soon as circumstances change, a violent and massive repolitization will appear on every level of activity which seemed to have been abandoned. The point is to try to penetrate to a certain reality of political affairs within, but also outside of, the philosophy of politics, outside the framework of a positive conception of history, that imaginary shelter to which we are led equally by the theory of the proletariat as a universal class and by the religious idea of the becoming of the spirit. In Clement Lefort's remarkable formula, here the point is to reject at the same time the conviction that the ultimate questions are answered and the conviction that there is nothing except questions of fact. Besides, these two orientations leads to the same result, as we noted by Lefort. Political reflection takes place within a limited horizon. Political science and Marxist ideology have come to be two examples of contemporary conservatism. To sum up, political analysis is generally conducted on either a philosophic level, political philosophy, or on a scientific level, political science. On the former level are, for example, such remarkable works as those of Eric Weil, but I do not agree with him that today's central problem is to reconcile historical customs with the state as their guardian, with a world organization fighting to control the forces of nature by means of contemporary technology. That is a theory of political phenomenon which will not be adopted in this book. The second type of analysis attempts to use a scientific method to describe and analyze the same phenomenon. Innumerable works of this kind exist, but I will try here to use a different approach. My essay will be neither scientific nor philosophical, and will therefore hardly be regarded as serious, and yet I believe it has substance.